Welcome everyone to our webinar, Land on the Horizon, Horizon Scanning for Policy Challenges Facing Land. Today we are joined by my colleague, Joseph Lewis. Joseph is the policy lead for the IES and is responsible for delivering policy for the IES and working to promote the use of environmental sciences in decision making. This webinar today will provide a brief update on environmental policy relating to land use and nature. As always, there'll be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, so please submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. At any point during the presentation, I will ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you everyone for logging in today, and I'll now hand over to Joseph.
Amazing, thank you. As Derek says, what we're going to be talking about today are some upcoming horizon scanning issues focused on land and some of the natural systems linked to land. Particularly, we'll be talking a little bit about nature and biodiversity as we go through things, specifically in the context of biodiversity on land. Before we begin, I do want to give you a couple of quick caveats to what we're going to be talking about today. The first is that naturally there's quite a lot of technical detail on a lot of these issues, and we won't go down into the practical technical detail or in some cases some of the regulatory technical detail, just because whilst I think that would be phenomenally useful for some people, for other people it's going to be no use at all. And so if you have questions about the specific elements of technical detail about any of these issues, feel free to pop a question in the Q&A box about them, and maybe we'll have a chance to pick it up in the Q&A. But if not, we can also pick it up via email afterwards, and we can talk about that in a little bit more detail if that's of interest. But I won't be going into that level of detail for everything. So all of these issues have a degree of nuance, and we're not going to pick up on every element of nuance just because we don't have the time this afternoon to do that. The other caveat is, of course, that a lot of these issues are issues of a degree of political sensitivity, and in light of the fact that over the next fortnight we will be seeing a change in political leadership in the UK specifically, a lot of the issues which are England focused or UK focused might be subject to a degree of change. Perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A as well if we want to, but all of this comes with those caveats. In terms of the context of what we'll be talking about, some of you will remember a couple of months ago, we did one of these webinars talking about water and horizon scanning some of the upcoming policy challenges for the water systems in the water sector. This is the natural continuation of that. We'll be talking about land today, and then potentially in a few months' time, we'll be continuing to talk about some other natural systems as well. For now, the focus of this is going to be looking at how policy affects land and potentially how it will affect your work if you're working on land, or in general, some of these natural systems we might care about. So let's hop straight into that now. So indeed, we'll be talking about how environmental policy is affecting land, natural systems on land. We'll be doing some horizon scanning. We'll be talking about recent policy developments over the past sort of 6 months or so, and in some cases a little longer than that. But also we'll be talking into the future, some things we might expect to happen as well. So hopefully we'll be able to get started. So the first thing I want to talk about on the framework level is the environmental targets. So what you, if you're not familiar with what these are, under the Environment Act, so this is one of the pillar pieces of legislation after the UK's exit from the EU, we need to see the government setting targets which are long-term, which are legally binding on the government, i.e. they need to meet them, and which cover a range of natural systems, but specifically 4 areas needed to be covered, and those were on water, nature, waste and resources, and then on air. And air also had to have a specific target on PM 2.5 set alongside it. Within that framework, there are a number of targets we care about when we're talking about land. And the reason that these matter is that going forward over the next 15 years or so, these are going to be one of the main accountability mechanisms we see for the government's approach and whether or not its policies are actually delivering on its objectives. This is one of the main legally binding accountability mechanisms. And there are a number of targets that we might care about. The place we are at the process of this at the moment is that after a 2-year-long scoping process, we reached the point that there was a proposed set of targets. These were subject to consultation at the start of this year. And in theory, at the moment, the stage that we're in is that they've had the consultation responses, the government is considering these, and that it will turn around a final list of targets. that needs to be passed through legislation by the end of October. That's a requirement of the Environment Act. So we should imminently be seeing the final list of targets and what we can expect from those. And I think the expectation is that they will be very similar to the targets that came out in the proposed paper. And that's the targets I'm going to talk about. But obviously, we need to bear in mind there's the possibility they might be subject to some degree of change, particularly on the finer details as we go into that final set of targets. There are 4 which are directly affecting the system of land. The first is on species abundance. So this is a nature target, and this is about increasing species abundance. I mean, you can see on the slide, it needs to be increased by at least 10% compared to 2030 levels. Naturally, that's a target that's come under some degree of scrutiny because we don't yet know what the 2030 levels are. And to the extent that the species abundance may and probably will decline between now and 2030, it creates sort of some challenges for that. And the reason it's 2030 levels is that it is paired with a government commitment to halt the decline in species abundance by 2030. And then the idea is under this target that it would be increased 10% above that halted bottom line. The second target is about extinction risk. So it is red list level, and it is improving the state of that by 2042. You'll see most of these targets are around 2042, so the 20-year mark. Some of the targets are set for different end dates. That's not too much of a problem with the land targets, but it's just something to bear in mind that they're not all uniform in terms of exactly when they're going to be measured against. Habitat restoration is looking at 500,000 hectares of created or restored wildlife-rich habitats. And if you want to know the specific technical elements of what they're constituting a wildlife-rich habitat to be, all of this information is available in the government's evidence packs. There was an evidence process that was very baked into how these targets were developed. And you can see all of the evidence that the government was using and the way it made decisions on the basis of that. Now, not all of those processes necessarily followed the outcome of that evidence. Sometimes there were other considerations, sort of political considerations, policy considerations, which meant that the evidence itself was not the sole factor. But if you want to know what some of this evidence is and some of the specific indicators that they're looking at, you can look all this up on the government's website. And then the last target is on woodland cover. So again, another significant area of land that's going to be affected as the government seeks to increase tree canopy and woodland cover. And one of the key questions in the consultation was about the kinds of trees we're looking at and making sure that that's actually, it's not going to all be sort of monoculture trees. It's going to be something that's actually productive for the goal. And I'm pretty optimistic that that is going to be the measure that they use coming out of the consultation, but something to keep an eye on as the final element develops. So a number of things affecting biodiversity on land in there, but also significant areas of land use which are being sort of called before these long-term targets. So as we're talking about land use, as we go into some of the horizon scanning, this is the big context to bear in mind, which is that the government across the UK to some extent, but specifically in England, is really looking at big changes to the use of land over the long term. And there are also a few other targets which are going to be, to some extent, may have co-benefits or potentially to pose risks for land systems. The water quality targets are probably the most pertinent ones because there's sort of 2 significant targets on water quality, and they pertain to reducing pollutant rates from agriculture and reducing pollution rates from waste. And to the extent that those are significant drivers of pollution in water, they also bear consequences for land, particularly the agricultural target may have some significant consequences, hopefully co-benefits for the way we treat land on agriculture in the long term. Likewise, the waste and resource targets are likely to affect our approach to that and have some bearing on land. There's an extent to which the resource productivity targets also factor into construction conversations. Again, this is a conversation that's ongoing in the consultation documents, and so waiting a final solution in terms of how this plays out in the final document. But yet to be seen. What there isn't is a target on soil health. So in early iterations of the target framework, there was a proposed target around soil health. And for a while, the government went away and looked at options for how that could be measured and indicators and potential targets. ultimately, it was decided by the government that they were not able to produce a target on soil health for this framework. But that might be something that we see develop down the line. And we'll talk a little bit about the government's soil health action plan for England a little bit later. But the short-term answer is long-term targets. There is not going to be one on soil health unless there is a very sudden change in the final framework. The consequence of that is potentially quite significant for whether or not we will be gathering data towards those efforts, whether or not policy interventions will be specifically targeting soil and trying to improve its health to the same extent it would be for other elements of land and other natural systems. So potentially a very significant gap in the target framework. But overall, we can see that many of the core natural systems are being addressed, and potentially there are some relatively ambitious targets in there, although the overall level of ambition might be something we would have questions about. Leaving sort of the question about the full appropriateness of the framework aside, if you want to know the IES position on that, we have a response to the consultation, which is available for any members to view. But for the time being, I think we'll set aside that question and talk about the wider set of governance and regulatory changes that we're seeing. The context of this being, naturally, a lot of this is changes coming out of the UK's exit from the European Union, but also devolved administrations potentially developing some of their own innovative approaches to some of these issues now that they have a bit more freedom to do so. The one caveat to that sits aside is around the habitats regulations. So for a long while now, these have been a very significant factor in how we look at habitats, particularly on land. Particularly, there are sort of developmental considerations where the habitats regulations have been a very significant force in driving for, to some extent, an increased recognition. And I think there are certainly questions about the future of what those regulations look like. However, there has recently been a degree of doubt put into the future of the habitats regulations by different sources from within the UK government specifically. Having reached a point now where some politicians are talking about getting rid of nutrient neutrality, getting rid of some of these elements of environmental protection, I think there is a growing move from the construction sector that things like the habitats regulations and biodiversity net gain, which we'll talk about a little bit later, are further changes that they would like to see deregulated. And so there is a degree of ambiguity for the first time in a long time over the future of the habitats regulations, given the level of criticism they've received from some places within the government. And that's not to say that the government as a whole has issues with the habitats regulations. There have been quite staunch defenses of the habitats regulations. However, they certainly have a far more ambiguous future than in the past. Now, the big issue with the UK's exit from the EU is that there is a non-regression clause in the exit agreement, and that says technically that the UK cannot regress on its environmental commitments. So to the extent that the habitats regulations could have a degree of ambiguity in their future, it's something that we think we would probably be facing some new regime to look at this instead. But certainly the non-regression clause is not so powerful that it completely prevents this. And there's a degree of interpretation that actually means it can end up being a little bit loose. So as we look at things like the habitats regulations and the wider review of laws retained by the UK after its exit from the European Union, there's a degree to which there could be some de facto regression on environmental commitments and regulations, even if technically speaking they are not actually regressing per se. And what that might look like is processes which are designed to be faster, to streamline these considerations, and to make them less robust in the level of data that they're collecting potentially. The exact nature is yet to be seen, but as we move on a little bit later to talk about environmental outcome reports and the future of EIA, these are some of the considerations we'll want to be bearing in mind. This is where the criticism and critique in some of the political spheres is currently going on. So as I've said, part of that is also that the government has a close eye on these laws which have been brought over from the European Union, and there are different opinions and approaches in government. So the Environment Secretary at the moment has been quite vocal that many of these are actually just sound regulations, and there's not much point in reinventing them for the sake of it. Whereas other politicians and political sources have been more vocal about significant changes to what those regulations look like. I think in practice, the day-to-day is unlikely to see a significant shift, but we might expect, depending on exactly the approach the next government takes, some degree of change still to come on some of these retained EU laws. And then the other element of shifting governance is going to come in the refresh of the environmental improvement plan. So the government's first environmental improvement plan, which is the 25-year environment plan, has lived through its first iteration. We're expecting to see the second version at the beginning of next year, and conversations around what that's going to look like playing out towards the end of this year. Significant consequences across environmental governance, but potentially land is going to be particularly in the frame in this one, for some reasons we'll pick up on the next slide. It's due at the start of next year. We won't know exactly what that's going to look like until we get it, but we should be expecting more conversations about exactly how that governance will operate. It's not going to change many of the things we've already talked about in terms of governance. It's not likely to rip up regulations on its own, and it doesn't change things like the environmental targets, scrutiny organizations like the OEP, and indeed its equivalents in other countries, in other nations. But it may still give us some indication of the government's approach to some of these big issues on environment in general and land specifically. So one of the biggest issues that is currently sort of being discussed, that is likely to be affected by a number of policies coming down the line, is, as indicated earlier, land use and the government's approach to landscapes. So these two issues somewhat connected, but also somewhat distinct in the way that policy interacts with them. A number of significant changes on land use. The first is around agriculture. So we've talked about this a little bit already. There are two significant elements to which agriculture, in theory, was on a trajectory towards more environmental outcomes. The first is the environmental land management scheme. So this is ELMS, and the sustainable farming incentive, including the public money for public goods approach, which is, if you're doing things which are environmentally beneficial, that ought to be part of the payments you're receiving. And this is a significant shift over from the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy and basic payments under that. This is England-specific ELMS, and there's some degree to which it's been placed under a bit of doubt recently by not only sort of comments more generally, but also documents like the environmental targets, evidence packs, where previously we were in a position where politicians and government departments were talking about significant systematic changes to the way that agriculture is funded and carried out. We're now seeing questions about the extent to which policy considerations will get in the way of delivery on the full scale of ELMS. We're seeing reductions in overall budgets and other factors which might make us think that ELMS is shifting away from an environmental approach and more towards some of these concerns around food security and other issues which have historically been issues, and now again, due to sort of current crises in the world, are likely to be an issue again for a lot of people. So that's seen a bit of a shift recently. And then the second half of this is, of course, the governance level frameworks. So we've already talked about the environmental targets, how they're likely to affect agriculture to some extent, but also wider schemes and some of the nature schemes play into this as well. And as we move on to those conversations a little bit later, we'll see how that plays in. The other side of the question is around planning, and this is particularly a consequence for your more urban landscapes, but also brownfield land, some of these considerations. Where historically EIA, so environmental impact assessment, has been the predominant tool by which we make assessments about planning considerations, we are moving away from that at this point. The government's Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill is a proposed piece of legislation. It's currently before Parliament for consideration, and it proposes a move from environmental impact assessment towards environmental outcomes reports. Now that sounds just like a difference in wording, and in many ways that kind of is what it is. This is an England proposed regime. There is an attempt by the government also to push it beyond England, yet to be seen the outcome of that effort. And the key consideration here is that whilst the process is subtly different, the main hanging elements of the new regime are all subject to secondary legislation. And what that means is they're not debated on the face of the bill itself, so we don't yet know what they will look like. And the two big questions are, one, which consents, which potential planning developments are they likely to apply to, and where will they not apply, or where will they apply less stringently? The second is what outcomes will be considered, i.e., what environmental considerations will be fundamentally part of the planning process in the way that they would have been under an environmental impact assessment in the past, or even an SEA or anything like that. These questions we don't yet know. They will come after the legislation is passed through Parliament, and therefore there are question marks all over exactly what this will look like, and a lot of ambiguity still on the future of this. It's likely to be quite substantially similar. However, probably around the margins, we will see some changes there. And so it's something very much to be aware of. And if you want some more information about that, we've got briefings on this available on the IES website for all of our members about exactly what the changes are proposing and what to expect going forwards. There are also changes in Scotland, the 4th National Planning Framework, potentially, again, making some subtle changes to how planning is going on in Scotland. But there are still question marks on how that will potentially interact with the Levelling Up Bill and the elements of that which apply across sort of the devolved administrations. So some positive changes there in terms of planning in Scotland, however, not entirely locked in yet. Still some question marks on exactly what that's going to look like. I won't go into the technical level of the 4th National Planning Framework and what's involved. If people are interested in that, maybe we can pick that up separately. There's also a lot of standards and codes on land going on at the moment on the use of land. The UK Forestry Standard coming out of government, the IUCN peatland code, so that's some guidance in terms of peatlands. And then we're expecting to see from the government the Soil Health Action Plan for England. This is about the future of English soils and the plan to improve their health. That was due around now, a little bit earlier than now maybe, but due to a number of issues, it's been pushed back. We're expecting we might get this towards the end of this year. It might be early next year. It depends on a number of factors about exactly where the new government puts this as a priority, with so many other issues that they sort of are forced to respond to. So certainly something to keep an eye out on. Potentially has the potential to be transformative for soil, but it depends on exactly what that plan and strategy looks like. So really interesting, and that won't just be agricultural. It's likely to be significantly agricultural, but it may also affect sort of the contaminated land, urban soil sphere as well to some extent. But we'll see exactly what comes out of that when it's available. Has the potential to make a big difference, has also the potential to do very little, depending on what the measure of it is. And the other framework we're expecting to see next year is a land use framework. Now, the National Food Strategy requested this in the government's response. It is promised that we will be getting a land use framework next year. Until that exists, we don't have this overarching thing that ties together the ways we're using land across agriculture, planning, across urban soils, across agricultural, rural soils, and land. None of this land use ties together. The question of peatlands, the question of forestry, the question of protected areas, all of these exist in their own spheres, and there has been a thread carrying through them. In theory, this land use framework will bring together these questions in the National Food Strategy with all of these other conversations that we're having as well about the ways we're using land. So potentially, again, quite a transformative document, depending on the measure of it. And we're expecting to see that next year. So again, for horizon scanning, something to be aware of. Landscape recovery is all tied into this to some extent. The backstory to this is in 2019, the final report of the Glover Review set out a number of recommendations. The government's response was at the start of this year, picking up on the AOMBs, so and the national parks elements particularly. That led into a consultation that ran at the start of this year, as I say, and the response to all of this is an increased role in nature recovery of AOMBs and national parks, but we're not yet seeing the promise of a full implementation of the Glover Review recommendations. So still missing that big top-level framework approach potentially. We'll see if the land use framework is able to pick up on that. But potentially landscape level change isn't something that is on the table right now for AOMBs and national parks. And like I say down here, there's potentially a lack of a strategic approach until we've got that land use framework. The other element of this is the nature and biodiversity side. So this is where potentially the global changes are a little bit more pertinent than the UK ones. COP15, this is the 15th COP for the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the major biodiversity treaty coming out of Rio. It's been delayed a number of times due to COVID. It was meant to be held in Kunming a couple of years ago. It has been delayed and delayed. Finally, now we have a date for it in December to wrap up the negotiations, and it's moved to Montreal in Canada. And the expectation is that as a result of that, this date will stay in the diary and it will actually happen at this point. The reason this is so important is it's where we're going to get that post-2020 framework for global action on nature. And previously, the UK has talked quite a significant game about taking a leading role in this and trying to push for it to be a very useful framework. It's yet to be seen if that will be the UK's role or if anybody else is going to sort of step into those shoes and try and make it a useful framework. The other element globally is the IP Best Values Assessment, which is now being published sort of last month, gives you a comprehensive summary of the evidence underpinning nature's value, the way people value nature's, and the way we can reconcile all these different approaches, potentially for the benefit of transformative change, addressing biodiversity loss. So significant evidence on that, sort of akin to IPCC reports on the climate change angle, but not quite the same. In the UK, the government set out a nature recovery green paper, and it was subject to consultation at the start of this year. This contains many of the policies we've already talked about, but also some others, particularly around biodiversity net gain. The implementation of this has been sort of subject to significant challenges at the local level due to the extent to which capacity exists, funding exists, expertise exists to address it. There was a consultation on the 3.1 metric of biodiversity net gain. So for those of you who don't know, this is about the extent to which in planning developments, we're making sure there is a positive benefit on biodiversity overall. There's a metric in which we can apply that system. It's quite complicated. It's subject to consultation at the start of this year, and now potentially subject for further review under the Environmental Act, under the Environment Act's requirements. We're expecting further updates to come on that soon, hopefully also addressing the capacity and skills issues that have meant that we haven't had the best possible implementation of biodiversity net gain, but essentially, again, a really useful benefit. The other element of this is local nature recovery strategies, the LNRS. The launch of these began in April in a couple of sort of pilot areas. It's expected to pan out across the place, across the country going forwards. And we're expected also to have guidance for land managers on this, on getting it in place by the end of this year. There's a process going on at the moment, which is sort of reviewing the exact implementation of that based on some of the pilots and making sure it gets more widespread. But basically, we're in the process now of, at the local level, getting these strategies for nature recovery that are locally led, but join into this big picture, this nature recovery network that the government hopes to have in place across the country by 2042, bringing together all of the nature elements of this. So it's the sort of the equivalent of your land use framework for nature, but in a more dispersive sort of way, in theory. That network of different schemes and people ought to exist by 2042 is the idea. So a lot going on nature, both globally and locally. There's a discussion about the extent to which they're tied up, but that will have to come after COP15. And very quickly, I won't labor this too much, but on climate change, there are a few different elements of this that apply to land. So the net zero strategy has some potential co-benefits linked to sustainable land management. That naturally comes from looking at peats, looking at the way we're using forests and trees, but also in terms of looking at agriculture and trying to make that less of an emitter, naturally has some benefits for sort of sustainable land management, biodiversity, soils, some of those benefits. So as a result of climate change, the potential there for some major co-benefits. And you can see on the slide some more information about what the net zero strategy says. We might expect a little bit more of this because, again, due to the government's legal challenge on this, we're expecting to see some further detail on the net zero strategy going into the start of next year by the end of March. So potential benefits there. However, the overall picture on climate discussions is there hasn't historically been a unified approach to land. That might be changing at COP27 in Egypt. They have thematic days on science, on adaptation, and agriculture, and on biodiversity. Hopefully, these are going to be issues which bring together that systemic conversation about land that's been missing at the global level. That means we haven't been able to capture that land use question in climate change. So I won't go into too much detail on that. If people are interested, they can ask questions. So what are the opportunities for the environmental profession to engage in these developments? It's not on water, it's on land. That's a typo on the slide. It's quite simple. The voice of professionals is going to be needed on a lot of these implementation questions, because that's where the experience of the practical element of this is going to come in. It's going to help to deliver on questions of implementation, but also make sure that those governance frameworks are practically actually applicable to the real world. Just showing the value of science on land and what that can mean, particularly for some of these systematic discussions we're expecting or perhaps hoping might come out of the land use framework and some of these questions. And that's really where we need engagement. So how can you engage? Well, without going into too much detail for now, there are two ways. One is directly, you can engage in these consultations, and there are going to be still many, many more of these as policies are subject to final review and implementation. You can contact your Member of Parliament about some of these things going through the legislative process, and in devolved administrations, you can contact your local representatives as well. And these are particularly sort of the levelling up bill that's subject to parliamentary review at the moment, and some of these other conversations that might emerge out of the new government's approach. And then you can also engage directly with some of the regulators and departments you might be in contact with, and try and help feed into the way they're tackling issues. And that's often going to be best where you've got useful evidence from your work about how things are working practically that's going to help them, because I think a lot of the time they're really keen to hear about those examples that help them engage in actually implementing it in a useful way. You can also engage indirectly. So the IES has conversations with all of these people, helps to shape these policy processes, and we work with our partners to collaborate and engage in these conversations to represent the voice of science on land, but also more generally. And so you can engage with us, you can engage with our partners, but you can also, we're doing some work at the moment about helping to provide policy skills to members, which maybe if people are interested in, we can talk a little bit about later, which can help you to be a better influencer on some of these issues if you are keen to share your voice and get engaged. But hopefully in the absence of that, the horizon scanning is useful for you regardless. It's going to be something that helps you prepare for some of these changes and identify how it might affect you and your work. For now, though, the key messages are really simple. It's a crucial period for land use and nature, and the future of environmental governance is currently being determined by a lot of these changes. Secondly, positive action is taking place at a local level, national level, and a global level. There's the potential for improving the way we address issues facing land, if we go with the right things, if we make the right changes. But there's still a lot more action needed. And so there are many opportunities for environmental sciences to engage and to influence change. That's the top level message. But for now, I'd be really happy to take any more questions, talk about anything else in more detail.
Perfect. Thank you, Joseph. We do have a couple of questions here, so I'll just start with the first one from Jamie. With the expected move from EIA to EOR, do you anticipate a rewriting of the current scheduling of development?
For clarity, is just a very precise wording clarity. When you're talking about current scheduling of developments, questioner, perhaps you can pop in the chat or another question. Are you referring to developments which are currently scheduled that might change, or do you mean in terms of schedules around sort of like schedules with a capital S? Because those are two different questions. And while you give us your answer, I might try and answer both a little bit. In terms of upcoming developments, obviously new regulations will apply after they're introduced. So they won't affect things which have gone through EIA now. To the extent it might affect sort of future planning scheduling, there will be some degree of change, but this is also tied up in several other issues which are sort of prospective, which are the new government might significantly change a number of the other rules around nutrient neutrality, potentially around biodiversity, and again, potentially habitats regulations. There are question marks sitting above all of those, and currently some of those are affecting sort of the forward schedule of urban land use and developments. So potentially, yes, it might have some bearing on that, but also there's so many other factors that it's not likely to be the sort of sole determinant factor. In terms of sort of schedules more generally, sort of guidance level approach to the planning regime, I'm not sure this is what you were asking, but in case it was, a slightly more technical question, it is likely to see some degree of change, yeah, as the, well, it depends on the extent of change. But if your environmental outcomes in the EORs are significantly different from the approach we'll be taking under EIA now, if we're looking at a different set of considerations, naturally some of the more technical regulations and sort of the schedules, these sort of things are going to be subject to some degree of change. So I hope I've answered both of the potential questions you were asking. If I've not answered the question you were trying to get answered, please just drop another question in and we can catch it this time.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here is, I understand Scotland would not fall on the Environmental Act as it falls out of its legal jurisdiction. To what extent is Scotland subject to the governance and policy strategies, example, the land nature recovery strategy?
Yeah, so this is one of those thorny questions of devolved governance. So yes, you're correct that so the environment is in theory a retained issue under devolution, which is what it means basically is Scotland has complete say over its environmental policy to some extent. However, there are some issues which are within what we might consider the environment, which are still retained on a national level. And there are some rare exceptions where the UK government might seek to engage in a UK-wide policy. And that exception is what we're looking at in terms of Levelling Up Bill, is that they've put in a request for some of the terms of that act, and only some of them, to apply broader than just England. I'm not going to focus too much on what's going on with that, because as I say, there's a question mark over it, and it's not the example you asked about anyway. In terms of the Environment Act, there are some terms of the Environment Act which apply more broadly than England. There are also, the majority of the terms are applying to England. So I won't go into an extensive list on that. The example you gave around local nature recovery strategies, it's a little bit of a complicated issue. And the reason why is, as we know, land does not recognize the artificial borders that we put on top of it. A lot of the time, when we're talking about nature recovery, it does exist within the boundaries of a local authority, but it's going to have consequences over the boundary as well. And that's particularly true of the two land borders within the UK. So between England and Wales and between England and Scotland, that there will be considerations which are going to have effects across them, even in the absence of the full extent of sort of local nature recovery strategies directly as a regime changing it. The bottom line, though, is that actually in Scotland, there's already been quite a degree of progress prior to the Environment Act on local considerations, both on the nature side, but also things like climate, where local authorities have actually been doing quite a positive job of developing some of these considerations into their processes. That's not likely to be significantly overwritten by any of the changes going on in the Environment Act, is the important part of the answer. The less important part of the answer is that there's lots of complicated ways in which it is still likely to be affected by some of the changes which are going on. And I think whilst there are issues of legality around devolved administrations, they don't bear on the way that natural systems are likely to interact with one another. And so we're likely to still see some degree of change in Scotland, even if Scotland is not subject to things like EORs, which potentially it could be, depending on how that legislative process plays out.
Perfect, thank you. Another question, how do we approach engaging with policy as science professionals who may not have those skills or know the best ways to engage?
Sure. So the IES is doing a bit of work on this at the moment. One of the things that we're really keen to do is help give our members the skills which they want and which are useful to them. And one of the things that has been identified in the past is that these kind of skills around analyzing policies, being able to influence them, doing horizon scanning, being able to engage in that science policy interface are things that members are really interested in. So the first answer to your question is we will be hopefully providing some training on this in the future. I'd say hopefully we're doing some training next week, which is on the water sector and policy, but has a lot of stuff in it which it applies generally to the kind of things you're asking about. we'll also be doing more in the future around other specialisms as well. And we'll also potentially, as I say, hopefully be producing resources which are not training, but help nonetheless to help people engage. So that's the first answer. The second is that actually a lot of it flows quite naturally from the kind of reasons you would want to engage. If you've got experiences on the ground which show that implementation of something like biodiversity net gain is struggling, if there are issues with it, a lot of the time that will actually be of a lot of interest to policymakers, because they don't just make policies for the sake of it. They do want to see some degree of change. And so a lot of the time there are natural reasons why you might want to engage. I hope that answers it. In the very least, we'll hopefully be providing some of those skills directly through the IES in the future, so that should help.
Perfect, thank you. Another question here is, with a new Prime Minister next week, how much of the UK's approach to land should we expect to stay the same, and how much will change?
Yeah, so we answered this a little bit as we went through on some issues. The answer is a lot of the things we might expect to change might not necessarily change. And the reason why is obviously currently a political process is going on, and the politicians involved in that are giving some indication of what they might do if they become the Prime Minister. They're also seeking to win an election. And so to some extent, when they are trying to appeal to the public, it might be that as they have conversations with the public, their opinion changes on some of these environmental issues, which we know are perhaps a lot more popular to see action on from the public. They want to see significant environmental improvement. So not all of the things we're hearing now in terms of sort of rumors and speculation will necessarily be borne out. However, some of them may well be, because there have been strong indications from both of the current candidates for Prime Minister about what they might care about. I don't go into that in too much detail, but the main issues are, I think, most of this will continue to happen in some form. It's going to be about the flavour of it that we get from the new Prime Minister, the extent to which an environmental improvement plan might shift to reflect overall policy objectives of the new Prime Minister, the extent to which environmental outcomes reports put in place by the new Secretary of State, which could be the same Secretary of State, it could be a different person, may reflect a slight shift in the overall objectives of the government. I think that's the level on which we're likely to see the most changes. What are the government's overall policy objectives? I'd say the majority of this is likely to stay pretty substantially the same, but with slight adjustments.
Amazing, thank you. So that's it from us today. Attendees, thank you for logging in. I hope you found it beneficial and informative.